Here we are at the book club once again, and we have a rather spectacular text to discuss today, and quite a spectacular speaker too, if I may say so. So I'd like to welcome Manju Jedka, who is head of the English department at Sholini University. If you remember, some months ago, she came to us to speak about Sylvia Plath. And I remember that was a sort of wintry day, and she was in Delhi. Today, she is meeting us from Chandigarh, and she's going to talk about Dante. Now, every student of literature has heard about Dante. There are so many cross-references in literature. I can think of The Wasteland as a prominent text that makes use of Dante and the Inferno and so on. So today, I think is going to be a particularly interesting session. A little bit about Manju. Her profile is so impressive. She is, of course, as I said, head of the English department at Sholini right now. She isn't only a master of the critical field, teaching and writing articles and her PhD dissertation and all that, but she's also a creative writer. And she has 4 novels, 2 collections of poetry, 1 play, and some nonfiction also to her credit. She has been awarded the Lifetime Achievement Award by the Chandigarh Sahitya Academy. There are many other awards as well. She was given a fellowship by the Simone de Beauvoir Institute of Feminist Studies at Montreal. She is invited to teach at New York University, Yale, Oxford, Iowa, Illinois. She has a postdoctoral Fulbright Fellowship also along the way. So, a multi-celebrated, multifaceted person. Manju, we are very happy to have you with us today. And over to you.
Thank you, Mohini. And it's my pleasure indeed. It's a pleasure to be with you all. Yes, I remember the last talk that I gave on Sylvia Plath. What I like about your group, Mohini ji, is that there are so many like-minded people and everyone is fond of literature. Everyone discusses literature with the same kind of feeling. And there are lots of positive vibes floating around. So which is what I enjoy, yeah. And usually I catch it on Facebook, but I have just requested Satish ji to put me on the mailing list also. So it's a pleasure being with you all again. And I must confess, I'm not a Dante expert. I'm just an aficionado. I love Dante ever since I discovered him. Say about 20 years ago, I discovered him. But I do not know enough about Dante. I would like to know more about him. I would like to read more. There is so much material available, and there's so much depth that one can go into. So, we can only scratch at the surface.
Sharma 21 is on.
However, whatever I'm doing today, I'm sharing with you something that I know of Dante, and hopefully you will enjoy it the way I have enjoyed Dante's work. I have a PPT. I'm going to share it. Yeah. This is Dante, the Italian writer, poet that we have all heard of. And he is best known for his Divine Comedy, which has 3 sections: Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso. Right. I'd like to give you a background first. Dante appeared on the literary horizon when the language that was used was mainly Latin. This was the language of the Bible. But then some poetry was being written in the vernacular also. So from the high pedestal, he brought poetry down to the masses by using the vernacular. Earlier, in 1274, we know about the Roman de la Rose. The Roman de la Rose and the Arthurian romances, legends from Tristan and so on, which appeared in the vernacular. This trend from France spread to other European countries, including Italy. Now, in Italy, as far as poetry was concerned, there was this lyric poetry that was called the canso. And this canso led to the creation of the canzoni, anything between 1 or 7 stanzas or 8 stanzas, lyrical, primarily lyrical. And then the sonnet was invented, and Dante began writing sonnets and canzoni. Once he started writing, he started meeting the leading poets of the city, of the country, and particularly Guido Cavalcanti. Guido Cavalcanti, who became a sort of mentor. So Dante started writing sonnets, and once he got into the literary circle, people started knowing him, and he became an important person, so to speak. After him, Petrarch also wrote sonnets, and Boccaccio, and they all used the Tuscan vernacular. This attempt to bring poetry down to the masses in the local language was a sort of a revolution. And this trend spread to the rest of Europe also. When we look at Dante, the important works that we know about are primarily influenced by a few people, particularly Beatrice. One of the questions that always comes is, to whom did Dante dedicate his sonnets? And the answer is to Beatrice. Who was Beatrice? Beatrice was just a young girl whom he knew when he was just a boy, and she was probably 8 or 9 or something like that. The relationship between them was a very spiritual sort, a platonic one. She got married to somebody else. She was Beatrice Portinari. She married a wealthy banker, and she died rather early. Dante himself married somebody else. He married Gemma Donati, and this surname Donati will come into the discussion again. So he married Gemma Donati, but throughout his life, he was influenced by Beatrice. While Beatrice was alive, he was very close to her spiritually. When she died, she became like a guiding star, showing him the direction. Dante was born in 1265 and he died in 1321. His first important work was completed by 1295, and it was called Vita Nova. That means new life, new life. And in Vita Nova, he is mourning the demise of Beatrice. He's absolutely disoriented, he's grief-stricken, and at the same time, he feels that she's pointing the direction to a new life that he ought to be living. So Vita Nova is really his first important work. Then he also has De Monarchia, which is political in nature. And in De Monarchia, he advocates the necessity of having a strong ruler in the country. I think somebody's audio is on. If you switch it off, then I won't get the echo.
Bernali, please switch off your
Yes,
audio.
everybody, please switch off the audio.
Please.
Abid, maybe you could mute everyone and only the speaker would be have the mic on.
No more. I think everyone is switched off now.
Okay, so
Okay.
De Monarchia is political. And this was completed around 1312 and 1313. And in that, he says that the ruler of a country has to be strong. This idea that the ruler has to be strong comes up again in his Inferno, in the Divine Comedy, where he says that the world is full of evil, full of sins, and it will remain like this unless there is a greyhound that comes and drives all sins back to hell, back to nothingness. So the greyhound that he talks about in the very first canto is a reference probably to the need for a strong ruler. And then his most important work is La Commedia. It was called La Commedia. That is the title he gave it, the comedy, La Commedia. It was only his disciples, his followers, his fans, his readers who called it the Divine Comedy. They added the word divina to it, La Commedia Divina. So it became the Divine Comedy. I feel that if he had given the title the Divine Comedy, if he had given the title himself, it would be rather presumptuous. It would be rather, a sign of arrogance on his part, but he didn't do it. For him, it was La Commedia. And this was written in exile. I'll talk about his exile also. It was completed by 1320. So why does he call it La Commedia? Why does he call it the comedy when there is so much sin and evil that goes into the substance of the entire work? We'll talk about that also. Inferno, which is the first part of La Commedia, was published around 1314. And in 1321, just 1 year after the comedy was completed, Dante died in Ravenna of a fever. Right. Now, when we talk about Dante, we need to be aware of Florence, or Firenze, as it is called in Italy, Firenze. And those of you who've traveled to Firenze will know that it's really a beautiful place. There is a picture out here with the bridges and so on. Florence was the place, was the city where he lived, the city-state where he lived, and the city-state that he loved. So he belonged to it. He was passionately involved in the politics in whatever was happening in Firenze. A little bit about the importance of Firenze in those days. See, in 1265, that was the year that Dante was born, Florence had only 45,000 population, but by 1300, it had grown to over 100,000. And in Florence, as in other city-states, as in fact all over Europe, there was this struggle going on between the church and the state, between the king and the pope. We have read about it in literature. We know about it from Murder in the Cathedral, the story of Thomas Becket, and so on. And so this was happening. Yes, it certainly was happening in Italy, where the pope was located. So there was this struggle going on between the king and the pope. The clergy was very corrupt, and life in Florence had become rather commercial, not really spiritual, but commercial. Now, location-wise, geographically, Florence was also located on the trade route between the Mediterranean and Northern Europe. And because of its strategic location, the industry developed. So there was development of wool and silk industry, and Florence grew. When it started growing, it started conquering neighboring small towns. It expanded. And as it expanded, there were new circles of walls that were built, new churches and new bridges. In this picture that you have here, you can see at least 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 maybe bridges. So as it expanded, there were new bridges that were set up. And this is the river Arno. I've had the good fortune of visiting Florence and seeing these bridges. Unfortunately, when I went there, that was in 1994, I was not familiar with Dante at that point. Otherwise, I would have looked for, the landmarks associated with Dante and his life and his work. But well, perhaps someday, sometime. So this was Florence, and it was a very important city in Italy. Politically, what was happening? So as I mentioned, there was this ongoing conflict between the supporters of the Pope and the supporters of the Emperor. Now, the Pope's supporters were called the Welfs. It is spelled with a G, but it is pronounced Welfs. And the word comes from the family of the Dukes of Bavaria, the Welfs. So the Pope's supporters were the Welfs, and the Emperor's supporters were the Webelines. So this too is spelled with GH, but it is pronounced as Webelines. And the name comes from the castle of Webeling, which was traditionally owned by the kings, the political rulers, right? So we have the Pope supporters and we have the Emperor supporters. At this point, I'd like to pause for a minute and apologize in advance. If the teacher in me becomes too obvious, please excuse that, because I have spent 47 years as a teacher and still counting. So it's a little hard to put down all those almost half a century. I will try and not sound very teachery, but teacherish, but when you understand the reason, in case that happens. So we have the Pope supporters and we have the Emperor supporters, and there's a rivalry between the two groups. Now, this rivalry becomes even worse in the beginning of the 13th century on Easter, when somebody from the Welf family breaks his engagement to somebody from the Webelin family. Webelin family, that was the Donati family. You remember Emma Donati. Emma Donati, the woman that Dante married. So there was this feud between them because one person broke his engagement to the daughter of the other family. And so they started killing each other. Donatis killed Bundol Monti, who was a Welf. And then there were more complications earlier. So they became strong enemies. And then the Welfs split into the black Welfs and the white Welfs. So we have the Welfs, the Pope supporters, we have the radicals, and we have the moderates, the blacks and the whites. Now, Florence, these two groups, the Welfs and the Webelins, were both strong groups, and Florence repeatedly changed hands between the two of them, the Welfs and the Webelins, but mainly it was with the Welfs. So the influence of the Pope seemed to be stronger, and the supporters of the Pope were divided between the moderates and the radicals, the extremists. So Dante himself was a moderate. He was a moderate, he was a white Welf. However, the Pope favored the black Welfs. You see, the black Welfs were more rigid. They wanted the control of the Pope, and so naturally the Pope supported them. Dante was a moderate. As a moderate, he tried to bring about a reconciliation between the various groups. And doing this, in this attempt, he went twice to Rome, taking a delegation, trying to work out the differences between them, once in 1300 and once in 1301. Now, Dante, because he was a well-known person, because he was also involved in politics, he too had his enemies. And so when he went in 1301, all his enemies got together, the other party took over, the black Welfs took over, and Dante was tried in absentia. And they said, if he returns, he's going to be burnt at the stake. So he was tried, he was condemned on charges that were completely trumped up. This happened in 1301, and Dante died in exile in 1321. So you can imagine 20 years he spent in exile, and in those 20 years, he wrote the best of his works. In what conditions, you can imagine. When you're in exile, you don't have a proper home, you go from place to place, you stay sometimes with one friend, sometimes with another, and so on. And in fact, he has a poem in which he says that the bread of another person's house tastes bitter. It's not like the bread that you eat in your own home. So he died in 1321. Now, coming to the Divine Comedy, we see that Dante wrote it almost about 7 centuries ago. And even today, after 7 centuries, it continues to fascinate us across borders of time and space, across all geographical borders, across all borders of, centuries, even across the centuries, it continues to fascinate us. Why? I think towards the end of the talk, we will be able to figure out why, if it fascinates us, why it fascinates us, and first of all, does it fascinate us? Should it? Okay, so even after 7 centuries, we continue to read it, we continue to talk about it, and we continue to be fascinated by the Divine Comedy. What is it all about? The Divine Comedy talks about an imaginary journey of a protagonist through 3 realms of the medieval Catholic underworld. The medieval Catholic underworld. The medieval Catholic underworld believed in heaven, hell, and purgatory, right? And he is guided by Dante. The protagonist is Dante himself. He is guided by Virgil, the poet Virgil. And then he is guided by Beatrice. Why by Beatrice later? I'll come to that. All right. Now, while he is going through this journey, he encounters a number of souls, a number of people who are dead, whose souls are there in Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso. He encounters them, and these are souls of people who played an important part in European history and also in the history of Italy. There are characters from history, there are characters from mythology, there are characters who are still living, in Dante's time. So in a way, it was a ploy. You see, all the people who had wronged him, who had been mean to him, he put them all in various circles of hell. I think it's a great thing to do. And if I may intrude at this point, with a personal reference, I must tell you that in one of my novels, I was then young. I'm still young, but then I was younger. So this was when I was teaching. This was many years ago. I think about 30 years ago. And in our department, there was somebody a man in the guise of a wolf, or a wolf in the guise of a man, who was a bit of a nuisance, quite a nuisance, in fact. And he made life pretty difficult for me. And what I did was, in the book that I wrote, and that was incidentally my first book, so a lot of autobiographical content went into it. So I just put him in a van, and I blew up the van in a terrorist bomb. And I was very happy doing it. I hope that man is being tortured somewhere in one of the circles of hell now. All right, so this was Spots of Time. That was my first novel, right? So now what Dante did was something to that effect. He put all his enemies in the various circles of hell. And it's quite a treat. There are thousands of characters that we meet in those circles of hell, which I'm going to explain in a little while. The subject of Divine Comedy is both personal as well as universal, personal as well as public, in the sense that it is, on the one hand, it is a personal experience that he recounts, or even though it is imaginary. And at the same time, it is a spiritual journey that he undertakes. He talks about sin, expiation, he talks about union with God. So these are, strictly speaking, not personal matters. These are matters that anybody with a spiritual inclination is drawn towards. So it is personal, it is spiritual, universal, and at the same time, it is a political commentary. It is a commentary on the social, political, and economic condition of the times. So there is so much that goes into La Commedia. And as I said, La Commedia, it was in the beginning, the Divina was added later. The Divine Comedy is generally intimidating. Why is it intimidating? Partly because of its medieval cosmology. You know, the structure, the thought that goes into it, the way he plans out, the way he shows heaven, hell, paradise, and so on, all that is medieval. So today, living in the present times, we may find it a little difficult to follow that way of thinking. Then there is also a duality of form and content. That means he's describing an experience, but he's describing it in the form of a poem, in poetry, in poetic terms, right? So because of these various reasons, and then you see there are so many references to Italy of the 14th century, 13th century, late 13th and early 14th century, which we may not be familiar with. So for all these reasons, it seems to be a complex poem. However, once we start reading it, we have to understand, we have to be prepared to do a lot of reference work. And you will find that the Divine Comedy has been annotated, has been critiqued. I think there is a whole Dante industry that's been working on, particularly on the Divine Comedy. And we have some very good translations, considering that he wrote it in the local dialect. Even so, we have some very good translations by well-known people who have not only kept the temper of the poem, but also the meter, also the stanzas and so on. And I'm referring to a translation by John Ciardi. John Ciardi. I have 3 or 4 translations with me, but most of the time I use the one by John Ciardi and Mark Musa. Mark Musa. So these two together make a good reference point for Dante's Divine Comedy. Right. It's not moving. Yeah. Now, La Commedia is divided into 3 books of 33 cantos each. And then there is one introductory canto. So that means 33 into 3 plus 1, total 100 cantos. The first one, Inferno, the first book, Inferno, has 34 cantos. And in particular, I would love to go into a little detail of the first canto, because that is really, you know, it is a curtain raiser. It is the, what do you call it? It is the exposition. It is the first chapter. It is an introduction to the rest of the Divine Comedy. Now, I'll look at it a little later. In this canto, Dante encounters 3 animals. 3 animals, the wolf, the lion, and the leopard. The wolf, the lion, and the leopard. Right now, I'm focusing only on canto 1. So don't let the slide distract you, because the first 5 circles and the 6th, 7th circle and so on, we'll come to that in a little later. I'm referring only to the first canto now, where Dante encounters 3 animals. So it's like this. Dante in canto 1, he talks about an imaginary journey. How does it begin? He says, when I was in the middle of my life, about 35 years old. You see, in 1300, he was 35 years old, and that is when he started writing the poem. He says, in the middle of my life, suddenly I woke up one day and I found myself in the midst of a dark wood. The midst of a dark wood. I had wandered off the straight path. Now, this kind of a beginning we find in several spiritual autobiographies, whether it is St. Augustine or whether it is some other such writer. They talk about how they were lost in a dark wood, and then they tried to find their way out, and they started taking a few steps and so on. So he says, I found myself in the middle of a dark wood, and how I came there, I did not know. How did I leave the true path? I did not know, but this is where I found myself. And then he says, then I found myself at the foot of a hill, at the edge of the wood's beginning. So there's this wood, this dark wood, and then there is this hill. He goes to the hill, to the edge of to the foot of the hill, and he looks up and he sees that there is, the top of the hill is bathed in light. So that is something very positive, moving from darkness to light, again symbolic, moving from evil to God, moving from the dark to light, from sin to expiation of sin or whatever. So he says, I saw the top of the hill was bathed in light, and I decided to move towards it. As I decided to move towards it, there were 3 animals that blocked my path. The first was the leopard. And the leopard was very frightening. So he says, I was very scared. This is Dante talking to us. Now you see, the poem, it is after all one long poem divided into 100 cantos. In the poem, we have the poet who is addressing the reader from time to time, and we also have the pilgrim who is embarking on this spiritual journey. The narrative moves between the two occasionally. All right, so he says, so there was this leopard. So I moved back. I was afraid. And then, as I was wondering what to do, a lion appeared. And I was even more frightened. And then came a she-wolf. Then came a she-wolf. So with these three animals blocking my path, I could not go up. I could not go up. So what did I do? He says, I had no hope. What am I going to do here? How am I going to manage? And so on. Then suddenly, the shade of a man appeared. The shade of a man appeared and started talking to me. And I said, who are you? He introduced himself. He says, I am the one who was born in Mantua, and so on and so forth. And I talked about Aeneas going into the underworld. And so Dante said, are you Virgil? Are you Virgil? I have read all your works and I greatly admire you. So he says, yes, I have been sent here by three ladies who are in paradise. Three ladies who are in paradise. You have Santa Lucia, you have Mother Mary, and you have Beatrice. So they have sent me down here to help you. What is your problem? So Dante says that these three animals are blocking my path. I want to go there where I can see the light. Virgil says, you will not be able to go this way because this place, because this path is blocked by these three animals who will reign supreme until the greyhound comes to dispel all the darkness and to remove all sin. The greyhound, until we have a strong ruler, this is going to happen. There is going to be a lot of evil, a lot of sin in Italy. Symbolically in Italy. Italy is not mentioned, but we know what the reference is, right? So he says, I have been sent here to show you the way, but the way up is actually the way down. In order to go up, you have to go down first. You have to go down, and I will take you through different realms where you will see souls that are suffering, where you will see souls that are burning, souls that are suffering in inferno. You will see souls that are burning, but they are happy in being burnt. In the midst of the fire, they are happy. Why? Because they are being purified, and very soon they'll have the hope of going to paradise. So I will take you through inferno, I will take you through purgatorio, and from there, somebody else will guide you. I will not be able to guide you further. Somebody else will guide you, and that is Beatrice. Beatrice is going to guide you. Why can't he guide Dante beyond purgatorio? Because Virgil belonged to a pre-Christian era. And so he did not believe in paradise. This is the explanation that most critics give, that he belonged to a pre-Christian era. He was a pagan, so to speak. Virgil represents reason. He does not represent religion, but reason. So he is the voice of reason. He says, I can only take you down into inferno, then through purgatorio, and from there you're going to have another guide. Now, he is being taken down into inferno. Why? Because in order to rise above sin, you have to first know what sin is. In order to transcend the evil of this world, you have to first know what the evil is. And so the way down is actually the way up. So Dante is going to be led first into inferno, where he will see the various kinds of sins that human beings commit. When he is familiar with all those sins, then he'll be in a position to hate sin and rise above all kinds of sin. And then he will be in a position to be purged and finally to enter paradise. Right. So this is what happens in Canto 1, and that is the beginning of Inferno. The rest of Inferno is divided into 33 cantos, as I said, and Inferno itself, hell itself, is divided into 9 circles. 9 circles, which are roughly divided into 3. There is the upper hell, there is the middle portion, and then there is the lower hell. The upper hell has sinners who have committed sins of incontinence. Incontinence, meaning too much too much of anything, too much of gluttony, for instance, too much of passion, too much of hoarding or wasting, too much of laziness, and so on. So in the first 5 circles, you have the wolf representing sins of incontinence. The 6th circle is the circle of heretics who do not believe in God. The 7th circle, represented by the lion, comprises those who have committed sins of violence. And then finally, we have sins of fraud in the 8th and the 9th circle. Simple fraud in the 8th circle and compound fraud in the 9th circle. Now, this particular slide gives you the various kinds of sins. In lower hell, circles 1 to 5, as I mentioned, there are sins of incontinence. And before you enter the circles of hell, there is a vestibule. And in the vestibule, you have all the opportunists. The opportunists are those who never really took sides. And if you don't take sides, well, you're in both places as and when it suits you. So when it suits you, you can turn around and be with this party. When it suits you, you can turn around and be with the other party. So all those opportunists are there in the vestibule. And there, what is the punishment? They're just running round and round in circles, no direction, because they did not take any stand as long as they were alive. So even now, their punishment is that they just have to go round and round, being tossed about by a strong wind. In Inferno, there is something called the law of contrapasso. The law of contrapasso. That means symbolic retribution. That means you get the punishment according to, in proportion to the sin that you have committed. So if when you were alive, you took no sides and you were always wavering, sometimes following this flag or that flag, in hell, you have to, that's your punishment, that you will be forever being tossed about here or there, right? The first circle of hell is limbo. And in limbo, you have all the virtuous pagans, including Virgil. This is where he belongs, virtuous pagans, because they're not bad people. They have not sinned as such. It's just that they were born before the coming of Christ. So they're all put in limbo. And that is really a place that is dominated by reason. So there is this dome of light, which represents reason. And Virgil represents reason. After that begin the sinners as such. You have the carnal and the lustful, you have the gluttons, you have the hoarders and wasters, you have wrathful and slothful, you have the heretics in circle 6, right? So this is how it is. And as I said, the punishment is in proportion to the sins that they have committed. This is the lower hell circle 1 to 5. Circle 6 are the heretics. In circle 7, you have sins of violence. And violence, this circle is divided into 3 rounds. One is a boiling river of blood. The second round is a wood of suicides. And the third round is a plain of burning sand. And who are the sinners who are punished here? All of them have committed sins of violence. Violence against neighbors, violence against themselves, the wood of suicides, violence against God, neighbor, God, nature, and art. So that is circle 7. Each sin has been given a different round, a different kind of punishment. And then there are those guards, there are those monsters who are forever poking them, who are forever torturing them. Circle 7, sins of violence. And sins of violence and sins of fraud come under malice. So we have circle 7, violence, and circles 8 and 9, you have sins of fraud, which are further divided into simple fraud and compound fraud. Circle 8 and circle 9. Now, before I go any further, I must show you some pictures depicting the topography of hell. Now, this is how it is. You see, his idea of hell was influenced by medieval theology. And what did medieval theology believe? They believed that how was hell created? You see, God threw Lucifer out of heaven, and Lucifer fell to the earth. He fell to the earth, and the earth did not want to receive him, so it recoiled. And when the earth recoiled, it created a sort of a funnel with a vertex at the center of the earth. And what you see here is actually, you see, this is a sort of a funnel. And right at the bottom, you can see Lucifer, you can see Satan with his wings. All right. So, oh dear, it seems to have got stuck. Yeah. So these are the various circles of hell. And Lucifer is permanently imprisoned at the bottom. And all the sinners occupy the various circles in different colors. You have in the funnel, you can see different colors, and all the sinners are lodged there. Now, how did Dante classify his sins? His classification of sins was based on Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. You see, just shortly before Dante started writing his Inferno, Thomas Aquinas had published a commentary on Aristotle's Ethics. And so Dante must have read it. It was fresh in his mind. Division of sins he gets from there. Then he was also influenced by Cicero's work, De Officiis, right? And the principles of the Roman law, because the Roman law, there is a difference between fraud and violence. So these are the various influences on him. That's how he divides the various sins. And then he uses his own judgment also when he's dividing the various circles of hell and which sinner has to go into which circle. The first subdivision of upper hell is limbo, and that is a Christian addition to an otherwise classical doctrine. Now, this is another diagram showing you the creation of hell. You can see the funnel shape that has been created, and this diagram is from John Ciardi, from John Ciardi's book. You can see the funnel that was created when Lucifer was dropped from paradise, and then he gets stuck somewhere in the center. We don't have him stuck out here, but you can see this is a cross section of hell. There is the hemisphere of land and the hemisphere of water, and bang opposite is the Mount of Purgatory. The Mount of Purgatory, you can see it on the other side. On top of the Mount of Purgatory is paradise. So this is the yeah. This is another cross section. This is another cross section of Inferno. And the various circles, this is how it looks like. And most of the, it's rather small, but if you look at it carefully, you can, some of it's in some other language, but there is a little bit of English also, which, oh dear. Right. So this is another cross section of Inferno. And again, at the bottom, you can see Lucifer or Satan, who is stuck right in the center. Here we have hell laid out in the form of concentric circles. And the upper hell is what is shown out here. You have the vestibule. There is this dotted line which tells you of the journey, of the path taken by Dante and Virgil. So you have the vestibule where you have all the opportunists. Then you have circle 1, that's a limbo. Circle 2, the lustful, the gluttonous, hoarders, wasters, the wrathful and slothful. Then the city of, then there's the marsh of Styx. Marsh of Styx. Actually, there are 4 rivers in hell, and they have a common source. So that is also a story that Dante weaves into Inferno. And the boiling river of blood that I mentioned, that is called Phlegethon. So you have Phlegethon, you have Styx, you have the river Acheron, and Lethe also. Okay, so this is the upper hell. In limbo, you have the unbaptized and the virtuous pagans. There is this castle that you can see out here, and this is the Castle of Reason. Castle of Reason, and this is where Dante finds all the great poets and writers and thinkers of the past, who existed before the Christian era. This is another description of the various circles of hell. You have lust, gluttony, avarice, prodigality, wrath and sullenness, heresy, violence, fraud, and then in the last two circles, fraud and treachery, simple fraud and compound fraud. Now, these are further divided. These are further divided. For instance, in the seventh circle, there are 3 different types of violence that are described. In the 8th circle, when we talk about fraud, there are actually 10 different types of simple fraud. Those 10 different types of simple fraud, let me see if I can quickly tell you. The 10 different types are, there are the panderers and seducers, panderers and, they're mentioned out here, panderers and seducers, flatterers, sorcerers, false prophets, liars, thieves, false counsel, evil counselors, sowers of discord, and so on, right? No, sowers of discord come in the 9th circle. And each has a unique punishment. So all of them are not treated the same way, depending on what their sin is. There is symbolic retribution, there is the law of contrepasse. And some of the images that are created are images that you just do not forget. For instance, when you have in the second circle where you have lust, all the people who had, indulged too much in their passion, they are there. Dido is there, for instance, the Queen Dido, because she for her, love was everything. And then there are these 2 characters called Paolo and Francesca. Paolo and Francesca. And Paolo and Francesca were lovers. They were in an extramarital, illicit, so to speak, relationship. How did they get into that relationship? They were reading a book. They were reading a book that talked about the relationship between Lady Guinevere and her lover. It was something to do with King Arthur's knights. So probably Galahad and Guinevere or whatever. And as they were reading the hot portions, so to speak, the portions that were impassioned, they lost control over themselves and they got into this relationship, which was a sin. And now their punishment is that if earlier they experienced pleasure together, now they have to suffer together. So they are like 2 little butterflies forever fluttering together, and they are sick and fed up of each other because they are suffering now, but that is their punishment. That is how they are punished. And then there are some, so this image in particular stays in my mind. And then there are, in circle 8, you have the prophets and the sorcerers. Now, including Tiresias. Tiresias is also there. And their punishment is that their heads are turned the other way so that their heads are actually facing the back. So their heads are facing the back and they are suffering. So their tears roll down and fall on their backs and their buttocks and so on. They had tried to look ahead. And now their punishment is that for the rest, for eternity, now they have to look behind, right? The most striking image occurs in the 9th circle where you have compound fraud. And compound fraud, one of the compound frauds, is treachery against ties of kin. And the biggest treachery, the worst sin, almost the worst sin that one can commit is causing a rift between family members. And there is a character there, Bertrand de Bono. His punishment is that his head is cut off and he has to carry his head like a lantern, swinging like a lantern. So he is in this slimy, smelly ditch and they have to walk around all the time constantly, and they are beaten up by the guards out there, the guards of the circle, and he has to carry his head in his hand like a lantern. Why? Because while he was alive, he was a sword of discord between a father and his son. The father symbolically being the head of the family. So his punishment is that his head is chopped off and he has to carry his head around. The seventh circle, something I thought, as I mentioned, it's in 3 rounds. It's in 3 rounds. And you have the violent against neighbor. You have all these warmongers out there. You have Alexander, for instance, and all these people who waged wars in the world. In the middle circle, you have the suicides. And in the third one, in the inner circle, you have those who are violent against God. God, nature, and art. I will go into details. And then this is the river of boiling blood. So these are people who have committed sins of violence. They are in this river of boiling blood. And then there are these guards who are minotaurs. We'll call them minotaurs, I guess, half horses and half men. And they keep shooting arrows at them. In the 8th circle has 10 compartments, 10 ditches. And these ditches are called bolgia. The plural is bolje. So mal bolje, the evil ditches. And each of these evil ditches has different sinners. So you can see the division out here. Dante and Virgil have to go across all these bridges. Over one of the ditches, the bridge is broken. So they have to climb down. This is the hypocrites, and their punishment is, their punishment is that they have to wear a very heavy leaden gown made of lead, but outside it is gilded. So the outside is gold, but inside is lead, and it is very heavy, and they have to keep walking around, and they are suffering, and well, they had pretended to be something else, so now they are suffering. This is how they are suffering. Then you have the thieves out here. The thieves, you see, the thieves, while they were alive, they had tried to steal from other people. And now their punishment is that their bodies, all these sinners have bodies, by the way, their bodies are stolen from them from time to time. So some other sinner would come, some other soul would come and steal their body and so on. So this is the 8th bolgia. And at the end of the 8th bolgia, at the end of the 10th bolgia, there are 10 bolgias altogether. You can see there is one giant that is fixed out there. That is not Satan. Satan has yet to come. That is the beginning of the 9th circle. The beginning of the 9th circle, where there are all these giants and titans who had rebelled against God. They are in chains and they are frozen in a lake that is called Cocytus. The lake is called Cocytus. There is a steep incline. You can see here, this is circle 9. The whole circle 9 is a frozen lake called Cocytus. And this is divided into Cana, Antenora, Ptolemy, and Judaica, 4 different types of sinners, 4 different types of punishment. Now, what you see, let me see what's happened now. I'm sorry, just 1 minute. Oh dear. You know what, yeah. The top right hand and left hand, the lines that you see going into the margins, that is the previous circle. That means circle 8. And you can see there is a steep drop into the 9th circle. How do they get down there? You see, from one circle to the other, sometimes there's a steep drop, and then Dante has to devise ways and means of going down to the next circle. in this case, one of the sinners, one of the giants that's tied up has his hands free, and he puts up his hand, and Dante and Virgil stand on his hand. His name is Antaeus, the giant's name is Antaeus, and he brings them down to circle 9. The first round is Cana, then Antenora, then Ptolemia and Judaica. In Cana, you have, in all these 4 circles, you have compound fraud. In the first one, you have those who are treacherous with their kin. Next one, you have those who are treacherous to their country. The third, you have those who are treacherous to ties of hospitality. And the fourth one, Judaica, those who are treacherous towards their masters. And the biggest sinners, if you look carefully, Satan, he has 3 heads, 3 mouths, and in each mouth he has a sinner. They are the worst sinners. And who are these sinners? Judas, Brutus, and Cassius. They have sinned against their masters. Right. So this is circle 9, and Dante and Virgil cross these 4 rings and they come close to Satan. Now, Satan has these huge wings which keep flapping about, and they have to avoid these wings, otherwise they'll get injured. So Virgil now tells him, wait, when the wings go up, then quickly he grabs Dante and runs before the wings come down. He runs to the side of Satan and grabs the side of Satan. Now Satan has a hirsute body, and what you can see are long hairs. Carrying Dante, Virgil hangs on to that hair on his thighs, on his legs, and he starts climbing down. He starts climbing down, and they come to a certain point when something happens and Dante is spun around quickly, and then Virgil starts climbing up with him again. So he starts climbing up with him again, and he's wondering, Dante is wondering, why is Virgil taking me back? But he's not taking him back. He's actually taking him to the other side of the world. You see, the law of gravity operates, and that point, that center point, which is, what is it called? I don't know what it's called. When you have gravity, when the gravity changes. So they have to turn and they have to start climbing out in order to get out from the other side. So they come out from the other side, and I showed you this is where they come out. So they come out here. They come out at the base of Mount of Purgatory, and they see stars twinkling in the sky. So Dante asks, where is Satan? And where are we now? Where is Cocytus? Virgil has to explain to him that we have come out on the other side of the world. All right. So this is a picture. This is another picture of Satan with 3 mouths and 3 sinners in his mouths, and he is eating up Judas. Yes, this is where they come out. You see, at the bottom, you can see Virgil and Dante coming out on the other side of the globe. Now, the second book this is where the second book begins. And I'll just quickly go through Purgatorio and Paradiso because I have not worked so much on these 2 books. So in the second book, you have 7 levels, and these are called terraces. These 7 levels correspond with the 7 deadly sins: pride, envy, wrath, sloth, avarice, gluttony, and lust. All these sins we have encountered in the circles of hell. And again, here, the sinners have to be taught that they have to drop their sin. They have to be purged, right? Purgatory is a mountain. It's visualized as a mountain in the southern hemisphere, and some critics have tried to locate it also, that where Inferno begins is where Jerusalem is, and Purgatory is on the other side, the other side of the world. All right. So Virgil accompanies Dante through Purgatory, but he cannot accompany him to heaven because he was not a Christian. And Dante is met by Beatrice, his platonic love, who is going to guide him to heaven. Paradiso is the third book of the Divine Comedy, and this is, you can see the picture of Beatrice addressing Dante. And this picture is made by William Blake. So you have the chariot being drawn by the griffin, and then there are four ladies that represent the ladies who had, there are four ladies, four holy women who had advised, three ladies who had advised Virgil to show Dante the way. So here Dante meets Matilda, and Matilda prepares Dante for his meeting with Beatrice. Beatrice had requested Virgil to bring Dante on his journey, and this journey symbolizes the path to God, right? Okay, so my concluding thoughts on La Commedia. What do we take it as? Do we take it as a religious document or as a record of a spiritual journey? Well, as far as I'm concerned, it may be a spiritual journey, yes, but I take it as a literary masterpiece. And it was T.S. Eliot who said that Dante and Shakespeare divide the world between them. There's no third. There is no third. And I quite agree with T.S. Eliot. Dante wrote this poem at a time when religion was a given. It wasn't that, you may be religious or you may not be religious. Men just had faith, and the church was supreme. Even their day-to-day lives, in their day-to-day lives also, they were governed by their position towards the church. And that affected their political affiliations also. Even social relationships. I told you about Buondelmonte and the Donati family. Social relationships were also governed by religious and political affiliations. Florence had a unique position at that time. So all these factors we need to keep in mind when we study the Divine Comedy. And then there is that personal factor also, that Dante was a deeply religious person. That is what we find in the Divine Comedy. The Divine Comedy is also impacted by the fact that he was a victim of the political turmoil. The fact that he loved Florence, and for 20 years, for the rest of his life, he could not go back to Florence. And then, of course, there is the loss of Beatrice, which is sublimated into divine love. All these need to be kept in mind when we study the Divine Comedy. And with that, we are going to leave Dante and Virgil on their journey and come back to reality. Thank you very much.
Wow, Manju, that was
Thank you, Manju. It was very, very interesting. Enjoyed it thoroughly.
very fascinating.
But
Yes.
it's never enough. Dante is never enough. There's so much to do. Every line, there are so many annotations. When I had to teach it the first time, I spent the entire summer reading up just the Inferno. Never got around to the other two books because even this was not enough.
Okay. I think everyone, you can
Yes,
share
please switch on.
start the video
Yeah.
and
Switch on
lift
your
up your
videos
hand to say you want to ask a question.
Sakshi, we can hear your Sakshi, please mute your mic. Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. So folks, when you want to speak, when you have a question, please unmute and ask your question, okay? While you get ready to decide what question you want to ask, I just want to make one comment, Manju. I loved it, okay? I loved your presentation and I learned a lot, you know. I mean, as a student of literature, you come across Dante at every turn, you know, there's so many cross references to Dante, to the circles and so on and so forth. And you made it a little more real.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
I would say that possibly the literality, you know, of the sort of the geographical positioning of everything is a little alien thing. I mean, I find it so strange because I think now we don't tend to think of religion in those terms. It's a much more abstract, spiritual sort of feeling that we associate with religion.
Mohini ji, you are located in Pune, and Pune is more cosmopolitan, and it is in many ways it's different from other small towns and more facile places and so on. If you go into the interior of any state, people are very religious. They're very religious, and they, you know, it's my first brush, so to speak, with people from Himachal, from such close quarters. And I find that religion is very important for them. So they have their own beliefs. Partly it's because they live in a terrain, you know, where they are at the mercy, there are vagaries of the weather. And life is not so easy. So they have their gods and goddesses and temples and so on. And by and large, they are very devout and simple people. So the more tough their day-to-day lives are, I feel the better the people are. You know, it's only in the plains that you tend to be lax and you tend to take life for granted. And you have a lifestyle that is superficial most of the time because life is more or less easy. I mean, that's my way of looking at it. I have seen the difference between living in the plains and living in the hills, and I can see the plus points and the pros and cons of both.
Atika, do you have something to say? It's indeed lit up.
Yeah, thank you very much, Manju, for your deconstruction, so to say, of the Divine Comedy. What I'd like to ask you is that do you believe that this epic poem is as much an allegory of an individual's soul's progress towards God as it is mankind's progress towards peace? Is it both at the same time?
I think it is both. It is both. It is a personal record, and it's also telling us. It also has so many lessons for us, so many messages from us, if only we are willing to listen to them.
Two other things. One is that, so you feel that this is a kind of a moral evaluation of human nature. Would you say that?
Yes, it is a moral evaluation, but there is something personal also, you see, because it's not that he is holier than thou. He seems to understand that there are good and bad people, and then yet there is that human side of him that has been very hurt. It's been hurt because he was expelled from Florence for no reason, and there were people who were mean to him. So there were some people of the church, Pope Boniface, and there's another Pope, I forget his name. You know, he puts them, they are still alive, but he puts their souls in hell. Why? Because it's just their bodies that are living, their souls died many years ago. So there is that human element also. So it's not holier than thou. You can identify with him, you can relate to him, and you can see that feeling that the world has not really done the right thing with him, and those people deserve to be punished.
You spoke much more about Inferno, and you didn't speak as much about the other two levels of Purgatory or Paradiso.
No, I
don't.
don't.
Do you feel that there is an overwhelming emphasis on sin and evil in human nature?
You see, it is a comedy. It is a comedy because it has a happy ending, right? So that is what critics say. He called it comedy because ultimately it is a union with God. So I focused more on Inferno, and for the simple reason that I have not gone into so much detail regarding Purgatorio and Paradiso. Not enough to at least give a talk to enlightened people like you. So it would need a lot of study, a lot of study. But we do have a lot of references to Purgatorio and to Paradiso. But what I feel is that sin and evil is always more fascinating than goodness. Don't you think so? The devil is always more attractive than a godly person. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yes, I mean, talking in terms of writing about it, I would agree with you. The only thing is that the good side of human nature doesn't seem to come out. You know, it's the emphasis being so much on evil and sin and its redemption.
The good side of human nature does not come out. The good side of human nature, you're right, does not come out, because you see, Dante is being taught. This is the way he believes. He's being taught that you have to hate sin. You have to hate sin. You have to hate the sinner. And every time he shows some kind of emotion, in the beginning, in the first few circles, he feels very sad and he's almost in tears. And Virgil actually scolds him that you should not have any sympathy. You should not have any sympathy for these sinners. They are all people who deserve to be hated. You have to hate sin. And towards the end, in the 9th circle, he is a changed man. He actually kicks the head of one of the sinners that is sticking out of the frozen lake. He kicks it with a vengeance, because that man he's been an evil person, so he kicks him. And Virgil is actually very happy. He's very happy. He pats him on the back and he says, you are doing the right thing by punishing this man, because you too have to evolve as a person.
Where's the room for forgiveness? Where is the room for forgiveness?
No, they're not talking about forgiveness out here. They're not talking about forgiveness out here. They're talking about suffering in Inferno, and those who were fit enough to go into purgatory, then they are on that ladder. If you remember, there is T.S. Eliot also makes a reference to Guido when he talks about J. Alfred Prufrock. If I thought my words would go to someone who has to go back to the world and tell them, then perhaps this flame would keep still. But as far as I know, nobody goes back from these depths alive. So I will answer you without infamy. So there are all these quotations that we come across so often in T.S. Eliot, because Eliot was influenced by Dante. Now, Dante, this is the first step, that you have to hate sin. The next step would be that you have to transcend. You have to transcend and purify yourself if you want a union with God. So that will come through purgatory, and that is how you ascend to paradise.
But Christ spoke about forgiveness.
Yes.
No?
So you do not have the idea of forgiveness out here.
Okay.
At least I do not see it.
Okay.
I just wanted to bring in Milton and Paradise Lost at this point. And there also, I think Milton has done possibly a more remarkable job talking about evil and Satan than talking about God and good. And in fact,
that is why they say he was in the devil's party and he did not know it.
I know. But as you said, it's always so much easier and more interesting to talk about evil. Good is a little harder to describe. I don't know what that says about us, that we find it difficult to describe, but
no, it tells us that we are human beings. We are human beings, and as human beings, we are not perfect. And well, we all have a bit of Satan in us, a bit of Lucifer.
Of course. Yes.
I was going to ask Mukesh Williams for his comments.
Well, thank you very much. I listened with great rejoice at what Manju said. It was very nice. Thank you very much for the wonderful presentation. I really enjoyed. I have a few things to say. One is that Manju mentioned, rightly so, that it is a kind of intense drama that ends happily. Yes, it does end happily, and that's the Divine Comedy. And the last line of the Divine Comedy is really excellent. And he sees God not as a blinding flash of light, but as love. That's the key. And you have this line, l'amour qui mauvait le sol ilal triste, which is love that moves the sun and the other stars. So it kind of leads the terza rima, which kind of builds up the narrative. It leads to this conclusion. It is a kind of races to that conclusion that God is the eternal source of love, and that is what redeems. So I do feel that, you see, you have the circle in the beginning Inferno, which is an endless eternity of suffering. That's the circle, many circles. You have a terrace in the Purgatorio, which is to do with the effort of climbing, making effort. Those are the terraces. And you have a sphere in Paradiso, which is the structure of the universe. Sphere is the structure of the universe, of celestial bodies, the moon, the stars, and so on. So this is how people attain salvation. This is how they attain salvation. You have to move through this. So it is based on the medieval conception of Christian belief. So the poem brings Western literary, ideological, pagan, as you rightly said, and Christian thoughts together. So I think this is the didactic principle, and there is a lot of empathy in the poem. There is empathy, compassion, and there's a lot of pathos for the punished, people who are punished. So there is a kind of spiritual maturity that is moving through, and you have the humanism that develops, and later on you have the enlightenment that comes out beyond the Divine Comedy. I mean, in fact, the Divine Comedy contributes to changing the cultural and intellectual ethos of Europe completely. And it kind of, the Renaissance comes in through Florence. Florence is a place where the Renaissance comes. And that's a very interesting thing to think, and it kind of changed the West. That's my thought. So I would follow what Manju says, a brilliant presentation. Thank you very much. It was nice waiting at night here to listen to you. Very nice. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And Mukesh, there's a lady from New York. It's early morning for her. She's also attending this.
Wonderful, wonderful.
We have spread all over the world as such. Coming back, Sangeeta Singh, you've been switching your system on. Do you want to say something? Okay. Prashant, would you like to say something? And I think that will be the last we'll do. Any more? Prashant, would you like to say something?
Not really, because Manju has done such a wonderful job. There is nothing left out to contribute. I just thought we could briefly talk about the 20th century reinterpretations of Inferno. And I can think of at least one figure, that's the 19th century, that's Gogol from Russia. His Dead Souls is actually a reworking of the Inferno. And of course, certain events keep on recurring through 20th century literature. For example, Ian Foster refers to Dante when he talks about Brutus and Cassius, especially Brutus being put in the lowest circle of hell, when he talks about personal relation. So in one sense, the book has been there for the 20th century, but has not exactly been there. Because the point is, Dante was representing a worldview that was going to pass soon, whereas people like Petrarch were looking forward to a new age as such. So Dante is not seen generally as a Renaissance figure, whereas Petrarch is seen as so. So I think that's part of the, part of the fun, shall I say, or part of the situation about Dante. But as I said, I don't know the text very well. So I'll really be venturing into, should not be venturing into this.
I think it's a very important point. Dante's work has influenced a lot of contemporary writers, a lot of 20th century writers. And I think what we need to do is keep the text alive somehow in our discussions, in our literary discussions, because this is a text that should not be allowed to die. You know, it has such a broad base, such a wide horizon. It's the world that it encompasses is teeming with people, different kinds of people. So I feel for literature students, it's very essential to be familiar with this text. I remember when I was reading Anne Sexton many years ago, Anne Sexton in one of her poems also talks about, she talks about being lost in the woods, but she's talking about a nervous breakdown. So this same idea of being lost is interpreted differently by different writers. And the familiarity with Dante comes through. Our students also, at least those of us who are still teaching or in a position to talk about literature to different audiences, I think we need to keep such classics alive.
I think, Jeannie, would you like to say something? Okay, Mo, I think you take over now. Mo, you're off.
Thank you so much. I've had this eager curiosity about the Divine Comedy, and you have satisfied much of it today. And I've always wanted to read it. I've always meant to read it. And, I think I now shall actually do it.
Yes.
For mentioning those good translations, I should look out for them. And you said that they're in the same meter also.
Yes, John Ciardi has done an excellent job, and so has Mark Musa. I have Mark Musa here next to me, and it has a very good introduction, notes, and, well, whatever you're looking for. Between these two texts, I think you can do a great job.
So yes, I should acquire these and get cracking. Thank you. Now, I know that there are lots of students of literature here, and I'm sure they are, they were with you and learning and very much with it. I was just wondering if, because we have a large group of people who are not in the academic field, and they're not students of literature as such, they're just generally interested in literature. I wondered, while you were showing us your slideshow, whether this was getting sort of the stamina. I really wondered, but I'm not going to ask that question. But, for those of us who are curious enough, this was absolutely fascinating. So thank you so much. I really enjoyed those diagrams, the graphics.
And there are some, there are some more images that stay in your mind. For instance, frozen in the lake, there are two sinners who have been sworn enemies, and they are together, frozen together. And one person was responsible for the other person's death. Ugolino, you've heard of Ugolino? Huh? Yeah. Ugolino and his tower. And ultimately, Ugolino resorts to cannibalism to keep himself and his children alive. Huh? So Ugolino and his enemy, they are together, and Ugolino is eating up the head of his enemy. So you have these images that just stay in your mind.
Very powerful images.
Yeah.
Right. So Manju, thank you so much. Really, I cannot thank you enough, because this has been spectacular, really spectacular. I'm sure everyone has enjoyed it very, very much. I think the reason why we don't have more comments and questions is because so few of us really know enough about it to be able to ask questions on it. So you've done a huge service, to the community here, because you have told us, so much about it. I only wish we had more time, to.
Thank you. Thank you. I
Thank you.
discovered it late. I discovered it late and I realized what a discovery, and I felt that people must know about it. So I went
Absolutely.
deeper
Say
into it.
something.
Yeah.
If
Yes,
I may
and-
please button.
Yes,
I think what the big thing that she's done is she's demystified the Divine Comedy for us with those beautiful images and pictures, and so very well presented.
Yes.
Thank you very, very much, Manju. I was very
Thank you.
impressed. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm sure we all agree. Right. So thank you very much. Wonderful discussion. I'll just briefly tell you about what to expect next Sunday. So next Sunday, we have Amitabh Jindal talking about Anthony Doerr's novel, All the Light We Cannot See. Okay, All the Light We Cannot See by Anthony Doerr. That's on the 24th of October, presented by Amitabh Jindal. On the 31st of October, we have Arifa Tehsin, the author herself, coming to talk to us about her book, The Steed of the Jungle God. So those are the other two events in this month. And so we go on. We are now booked all the way to March, which is quite staggering and very enthusing. I'm thrilled. Okay, so Manju, thank you. Thank you, all of you who came here.
And more, Manju and all your friends, etc. Please join in, send your email IDs, etc. Whatever, so we can
Right.
be in touch with you and tell you about what programs are going on. So
That will be
please
very
send us
nice.
as
That will
much
be very nice.
information we could get from others. Like I just heard Mukesh Williams has given something.
Yeah.
So others can talk about it. Rajesh,
Yes.
we're waiting to hear from you, Rajesh. He's nodding his head. I saw him nodding his head. So yes, he's willing
So
to.
yes.
Oh, you're muted. You're muted,
You're muted.
Rajesh.
That's all right. Yeah.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Right.
Yes.
Yeah, it was a wonderful presentation and I enjoyed it. I enjoyed listening to Madam Manju. And there's one question which I don't want anybody to answer now, but do think about it, do ponder on it. What is the relevance of the Divine Comedy and why is it called the Divine Comedy? These are the two questions.
Let's not discuss it now.
We have run short of,
later.
yeah, we are running short of time. So you don't answer these two questions, but these are, I guess, important questions.
And
Really,
Okay,
Manju
just-
has. She
And
has
more-
really answered
More,
those
just to tell
questions.
you
And the
something.
answers will always be subjective.
Of course.
Of course, yes,
Yes.
yes, you're right,
Yes.
you're right.
We've
Okay.
just today more. We have got people from Japan to India to Dubai to
Africa, Ghana.
and
Ghana,
USA.
New
But
York, yes.
Hi, Sony. Good to see you. There she is.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. Hope to see you next Sunday. All the best.
Thank you.
Yes, yes.
Bye-bye.
And thank you very much, Manju. All the very
My
best.
pleasure. And thank you to all the listeners who joined in.